Good evening, and welcome back. The oldest story in the world was not handed down to us. It was lost. For something close to 2,000 years, no one alive knew that it had ever existed. No monk copied it, no scholar argued over it, no child heard it at bedtime. It lay under a mound of earth in northern Iraq, broken into pieces, written in a script that no living person could read, in a language that no living person could speak. And when it was finally dug up in the middle of the 19th century, the men who carried it out in baskets had no idea what they were holding. They thought they were collecting building rubble with marks on it. What they had, in fact, was a poem about a king who could not accept that he was going to die, and about the friend whose death taught him that he was. It is older than the Bible. It is older than Homer. It is older than the alphabet. And before we begin it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing how many places gather here in the quiet hours. Now dim the lights, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, and let us go back to the very beginning of storytelling. The story of how the story was found begins with a fire. In the year 612 before the Common Era, the city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire and one of the largest cities on earth, was besieged by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes and others who had suffered under Assyrian rule for generations. The walls were broken. The palaces were burned. Among the buildings that went up in flames was a library, assembled over decades by a king named Ashurbanipal, who had done something unusual for a warrior monarch. He had learned to read. He boasted about it in his inscriptions, which tells you how rare it was, and he had sent agents across Mesopotamia with instructions to find old tablets, copy them, and bring them home. He gathered myths, hymns, medical texts, omen lists, dictionaries, and letters. He built what may have been the first systematically collected library in human history, and then his city burned, and his library burned with it. Clay, however, does not burn. Clay bakes. The tablets that would have crumbled slowly over centuries in a dry room were instead fired hard by the destruction of the building around them, and then buried under the collapsing roof, and then buried again under 2,000 years of dust and silt and grazing sheep, until the mound looked like an ordinary hill, and the people who farmed near it called it Kuyunjik and thought nothing more about it. In 1846, a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard began digging into mounds in northern Mesopotamia, and over the following years, he and his assistant, an Iraqi Christian named Hormuzd Rassam, uncovered palaces, colossal winged bulls, and carved stone panels showing Assyrian kings at war. These were the finds that made the newspapers, but they also found rooms with floors covered in broken clay, thousands upon thousands of fragments, some the size of a hand, some the size of a fingernail. These were shipped to London in crates, where they sat in the British Museum, waiting for someone to make sense of them. The someone was a man named George Smith. He had left school at 14 and been apprenticed to a printer, engraving banknotes, which is delicate work that trains the eye. He spent his lunch hours at the museum looking at the Assyrian collection, and he taught himself the wedge-shaped script that scholars call cuneiform, and he was so obviously good at it that the museum eventually hired him to sort fragments. In 1872, he was working through a pile of them when he found a piece that described a boat, a flood, and a bird released to look for land. He was reading, in a text written centuries before the Hebrew scriptures were compiled, a version of the story of Noah. The account of what happened next is one of the more endearing moments in the history of scholarship. Smith is said to have grown so agitated that he began undressing in the room, which his colleagues found alarming and which nobody has ever fully explained. He announced the discovery publicly. A newspaper funded him to go to Iraq to look for the missing pieces, and, against all reasonable odds, he found some. Piece by piece, over the following decades, from that library and from other sites, the poem was reassembled. It was written across 12 tablets in the standard version, and even now it is not complete. Lines are missing. Whole passages are guessed at from parallel copies. When you read the epic today, you are reading a mosaic with gaps in it, and scholars are still filling those gaps, occasionally with a fragment identified in a museum drawer a century after it was excavated. Smith did not live to see much of it. He went back to Iraq a third time in 1876, in the wrong season, into heat and dysentery and quarantine, and he died near Aleppo at the age of 36, leaving a wife and several children with very little money. He had taught himself an extinct language in his lunch hours, recovered the oldest surviving epic in human history, and been dead for less than a decade before most of the public had stopped talking about it. The museum bought his notes from his widow. The work he began has never actually stopped. The poem exists in versions. There are older Babylonian tablets from the second millennium that tell parts of the story differently, and separate Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that are older still, and that read almost like folk tales rather than a single composition. The version most people read today is the one attributed, by a note in the ancient catalogs, to a scribe and exorcist named Sin Leki Unini, who seems to have taken the older material and shaped it into something with a deliberate arc, sometime in the late second millennium. He is one of the earliest named authors on Earth, and we know essentially nothing about him except his name and the fact that he had an ear. What emerged from the reassembly was not a religious text and not a chronicle. It was a poem, with a shape, with characters who change, with an ending that refuses to comfort you. Its opening lines call it the story of the man who saw the deep, the man who knew all things, the man who was weary and worn out with traveling, and who came home and carved his story on stone. It begins and ends in the same place, at the walls of a city, and it asks the reader to go and touch those walls and see how well they were made. And that city, and the king who built the walls and who made his people miserable in the building of them, is where the story properly starts. The city was called Uruk, and by the standards of the third millennium before the Common Era, it was enormous. It stood on the southern plain of Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, near a channel of the Euphrates that has long since wandered away and left the ruins stranded in desert. At its height, it may have held tens of thousands of people inside a wall that ran for something like 9 kilometers. It had temples raised on platforms, workshops, canals, storehouses, and streets so packed with houses that the roofs must have functioned as a second city above the first. It was one of the first places on Earth where a person could live an entire life surrounded by strangers. It is worth standing in it for a moment before the story starts, because the poem assumes you know what it was like, and we do not. The buildings were mud brick, made in wooden molds and dried in the sun, which meant that they were cheap, warm, and constantly dissolving. Rain took the corners off them. Every generation knocked the ruined walls flat and built on top, which is why the cities of southern Mesopotamia sit on mounds of their own former selves, rising a little higher each century. The streets were narrow enough that 2 loaded donkeys could not easily pass. There was no drainage worth the name. The smell would have been considerable. The food was barley, in the form of flatbread, and of thick cloudy beer that was drunk through a reed straw to avoid the husks floating on top, and which was safer than the canal water and was issued as wages. There were dates, onions, garlic, cucumbers, fish from the river, sesame oil for lamps and for skin. Meat was for festivals and for the rich. Clothing was wool, and the wool came from temple flocks, and the weaving was done by women in workshops that employed hundreds of them. And the surplus cloth was what the city traded for everything it did not have, which was stone, timber, copper, and silver. And above all of it stood the temple platform, whitewashed so that it caught the light, visible from a long way out across the flat land. And inside it, a statue that was washed and dressed and fed 3 meals a day by priests, because the god was not an idea. The god lived there in the building, and if the god was neglected, the river would do something terrible. That was the world Gilgamesh was king of, and its people were farmers and weavers and brewers and boatmen who had exactly one complaint about him, and it was a serious one. The poem introduces its king by describing the wall. This is worth noticing because it tells you what the poem thinks a king is for. Gilgamesh, it says, built the rampart of Uruk, laid its foundation, surveyed its brickwork. Go up on the wall, the poem says, walk along it, examine the base, inspect the masonry. Is it not baked brick of the finest quality? Did not the 7 sages themselves lay its foundation? The king is measured by what he leaves behind that will outlast him, which is a theme the poem will return to at the very end, after it has taken everything else away. Gilgamesh himself is described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a ratio that has puzzled readers for 150 years, since it is not a fraction that any ordinary parentage produces. His mother is a goddess named Ninsun, whose name means wild cow, and who appears later in the story as a shrewd and formidable woman. His father was a king. He is beautiful, enormous, and utterly without restraint. He can outrun, outfight, and outlast anyone, and he knows it. And this is where the poem does something that a simpler story would not do. It makes its hero a problem. Gilgamesh does not oppress a foreign people or fight a monster in these opening passages. He torments his own city. He takes the young men for his building projects and his games and wears them out. He takes the young women. He leaves no son to his father and no daughter to her mother. The people of Uruk, exhausted, do the only thing available to them. They complain to the gods. The complaint works, though not in the way anyone expects. The gods do not remove Gilgamesh, and they do not punish him. They decide instead that the problem is that he has no equal, and that a man with no equal has nothing to push against, and therefore no shape. So they resolve to make him one. They call on the mother goddess, Aruru, who had made humanity in the first place, and they ask her to make a second Gilgamesh, a match, a counterweight, so that the two of them can strive against each other and Uruk can finally get some sleep. She washes her hands, pinches off a piece of clay, and throws it down into the wilderness. And out of that clay comes a man with no city, no language, no name that anyone has given him, covered in hair, who does not know what bread is and has never seen a wall. He is called Enkidu, and the way the poem brings him from the wilderness into the city is one of the strangest and most tender sequences in ancient literature. Enkidu, in his first days, lives entirely among animals. He grazes with the gazelles at the waterhole. He does not know that he is not one of them, and the animals do not appear to know it either. He is stronger than anything on the steppe, and he has one habit that brings him to human attention. When he finds the pits and snares that a local trapper has set, he fills them in and frees the animals caught in them. The trapper, watching his livelihood destroyed night after night by something enormous coming out of the grass, is terrified. He goes to his father, who gives him practical advice of a kind that says a great deal about how the people who wrote this poem understood their own civilization. Do not fight him. The father says, go to Uruk, go to the king, and ask for a woman. The woman is Shamat, and she is a priestess attached to the temple of the goddess of love, which in Uruk was a position of standing and not one of shame. She goes out to the waterhole with the trapper, and she waits and when Enkidu comes down to drink, she reveals herself to him. They spend 6 days and 7 nights together, and when it is over, Enkidu goes back to the herd, and the gazelles run from him. This is the hinge of the whole first movement of the poem. He has not been weakened exactly, although the text says his body is slower now. What has happened is that he has been separated. He has become self-aware, and the animals can smell it, and the wilderness closes to him the way a door closes. He sits down beside Shamat, and because he has nowhere else to go, he listens to her. She teaches him to speak properly. She feeds him bread, which he stares at because he does not know what to do with it. She gives him beer, and he drinks 7 cups, and he becomes cheerful and sings, which is a detail no ancient scribe was obliged to include, and which someone chose to include anyway. She rubs oil on him, and clothes him, and cuts his hair, and he takes up a weapon and drives lions away from a shepherd's flock, and he sleeps under a roof. And he is a man. It is a curious sequence to find at the start of the world's oldest story because of what it says civilization actually is. It is not law, and it is not the wall, and it is not the temple. According to this poem, a person becomes human by being touched, taught to speak, given bread, given beer, given oil for the skin, given clothes and a haircut, and set to work protecting somebody else's sheep. It is a list of ordinary domestic things. The wild man is not conquered or converted. He is fed and combed and made comfortable, and then he cannot go back. And there is a cost, and the poem is honest about it. Enkidu is stronger than any man alive, and he will never again run with the gazelles. He has traded the herd for a friend, and the steppe for a city, and the trade is the same one every human being's ancestors made at some point, and it cannot be undone in either direction. The shepherds whose flock he guards that night have no idea that the enormous quiet man sitting at their fire is grieving. Then she tells him about Uruk, and about the king there who has no equal, and Enkidu, who has been made for exactly this and does not know it, feels something rise in him that he interprets as anger. He announces that he will go to the city and challenge this king, and change the order of things, and show him who is strongest. Shamhat, who is a great deal wiser than he is, agrees that this is an excellent idea and takes him there. They arrive at Uruk during a wedding. The custom of the city, the poem says without commentary, was that the king had the right to the bride before the husband did. Whether such a custom ever actually existed anywhere is doubted by historians, and it may be an invention of the poem for exactly the purpose it serves here, which is to give Enkidu something unambiguous to stand in front of. He goes to the door of the wedding house and plants himself in it, and when Gilgamesh comes to enter, Enkidu blocks the way. They fight in the street. The doorposts shake. The walls shudder. The poem describes them locking together like bulls, snorting, wrecking the doorframe, wrestling from one end of the marketplace to the other while the whole city watches. And then Gilgamesh, at some point, throws him. Or perhaps Enkidu simply stops. The tablets are damaged here, and scholars disagree about who wins. What is not in doubt is what happens immediately afterward. The two of them stop and look at each other and embrace and become friends. Not allies, not rivals who have settled a score. The word the poem uses again and again from this moment forward is the word for a beloved friend, and Gilgamesh's mother will shortly adopt Enkidu formally as a son. Enkidu, who was made as a punishment and a corrective, has worked. The tyrant has stopped tormenting the city. But he has not stopped being restless, and now he has a companion who is restless too. And 2 restless men with nothing to do are more dangerous than one. Gilgamesh begins to talk about the forest and about the creature who guards it. The forest lies far to the west, and it is made of cedar, To a Mesopotamian, this was not an abstract fantasy landscape. Southern Mesopotamia had mud, reeds, barley, and almost no timber at all. Every roof beam, every temple door, every boat of any size had to be brought in from somewhere else, most often from the mountains of the north and west, at enormous expense. Cedar was the material of palaces and gods. A poem about heroes going to a distant mountain to cut cedar and bring it home is a poem about the most valuable commodity its audience could imagine, dressed up as an adventure. The forest is guarded by a being named Humbaba, appointed by the god Enlil to keep it safe. He is described in terms that are deliberately hard to picture. His voice is the flood. His mouth is fire. His breath is death. His face, in one memorable comparison drawn from divination, is coiled like animal intestines. There is a clay mask of him in the British Museum, made of exactly those coils, and it is not a face you would want to meet in a wood. Gilgamesh announces that he intends to go there, kill Humbaba, and cut the cedars, and he gives a reason that is entirely honest and entirely revealing. He says that men die and that their days are numbered, and that whatever they achieve is wind. So if he must die anyway, he would rather die doing something that people will still be talking about afterward. He wants his name established. This is the first time the poem shows us that its hero has already understood, in an abstract way, that he is mortal, and that the understanding has not touched him at all. He treats death as a deadline. Later, he will meet it as a fact. Enkidu is horrified. He has lived in the wild. He knows what is out there in a way that a king raised behind walls does not, and he says so. He tells Gilgamesh that Humbaba's roar is the deluge, and that entering the forest is not bravery, but suicide. The elders of Uruk agree with him, and tell the king that he is young, and that his heart has carried him away. Gilgamesh laughs at them. This is the point at which the poem quietly stops being a story about a bad king becoming a better one, and becomes a story about a man walking straight toward the thing he most fears while insisting that he is not afraid. Before they go, Gilgamesh goes to his mother. Ninsen climbs to the roof of her temple, burns incense, and addresses the sun god Shamash with a complaint that is close to bitter. "Why," she asks, "did you give my son a restless heart? Why have you stirred him up to go on this journey?" Then, having said it, she does the practical thing. She asks Shamash to protect him. She enlists the winds as allies, and she puts a token around Enkidu's neck and formally makes him her son, which is to say she makes the two men brothers. Then they leave. The journey is described in a rhythm that anyone who has walked a long way will recognize. They travel a set number of leagues. They stop. They eat. They dig a well. They climb a hill. At each stop, Gilgamesh sleeps and has a dream. And each dream is a nightmare of mountains falling, of lightning, of a bull that tramples him, of fire raining down. Each time he wakes in terror, and each time Enkidu listens carefully and interprets the dream as a favorable omen, explaining patiently that the falling mountain is Humbaba, that the fire is victory, that everything the sleeping mind has produced is good news. It is almost certainly not good news. Enkidu is doing what a friend does at 2 a.m. when the other person is frightened, which is to say something reassuring with great confidence. The poem does not say this. It simply puts 5 terrifying dreams in a row and has them all cheerfully explained away, and lets you notice. They reach the forest and stop at its edge, and the poem pauses to look at it. They stand at the gate and stare. The text says, "At the height of the cedars, at the path worn smooth by Humbabas, coming and going." They smell it. Anyone who has walked into Old Forest and gone quiet knows exactly what is being described. One of the fragments recovered only in the last decade adds something to this scene that nobody had read for 2,000 years. It describes the forest as noisy. There are monkeys in it, calling and chattering. There are cicadas. There are birds making a racket in the canopy, and the whole din is described as a kind of music that Humbaba listens to all day, the way a person might have something playing in the background of a long working life. For a moment, before anything happens, the guardian of the forest is simply an old creature living alone in a loud green place he is fond of. The scribes who wrote that line put it there on purpose, immediately before two men walk in and destroy it, and having lost that passage for 20 centuries, and then found it again makes the killing that follows read very differently. Then they go in, and they cut a tree, and Humbaba hears it. The fight itself is fragmentary in the tablets. What survives is a confrontation in which Humbaba mocks Enkidu in particular, pointing out that he was born in the wild and has no business here, and Shamash sends 13 winds that pin Humbaba down and blind him and make him helpless. And then the poem does something that most heroic literature does not do. It gives the monster a speech. Humbaba begs. He offers to serve Gilgamesh, to cut the trees himself, to build him a palace with them. He appeals to him directly, calls him by name, points out that he had a mother and that he knows the forest and can be useful. He is, for several lines, not a monster at all, but a frightened creature bargaining for his life, and Gilgamesh hesitates. It is Enkidu who says no. Kill him now, he says, before the god Enlil hears about it and stops you. Finish it. And so they do. Humbaba, before he dies, curses them both and asks that neither of them grow old. The trees are felled. They cut the tallest cedar to make a door for a temple, and they float the timber down the river toward home with Humbaba's head, and they come back to Uruk in triumph. And the triumph lasts almost exactly as long as it takes for Gilgamesh to wash and put on clean clothes. Because when he does, when he washes the filth of the journey off, combs his hair, throws his dirty things away, and puts on a fresh robe and a sash and his crown, he is looked at. The goddess Ishtar, who is the deity of love and of war and of the city of Uruk itself, sees him and proposes marriage. Her offer is genuinely magnificent. She promises him a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, kings and princes kneeling to him, goats bearing triplets, his oxen unrivaled under the yoke. And Gilgamesh refuses her at length, and with a rudeness that has few equals in ancient poetry. He calls her a door that does not keep out the wind, a shoe that pinches the foot, a leaking waterskin. And then, having insulted her, he starts listing her previous lovers and what became of them. There was Tammuz, for whom the women still weep every year. There was a bird whose wing she broke. There was a lion, and a horse she gave the whip and the spur, and a shepherd she turned into a wolf, so that his own dogs bit him, and a gardener she turned into a frog. Why, he asks, would I be any different? Whether this is fair to Ishtar is a question readers have argued about for as long as the text has been readable. What is certain is that it is an appalling way to speak to a goddess, and that she goes straight to her father, the sky god Anu, in tears and in fury, and demands the bull of heaven. Anu points out reasonably that if he gives her the bull, there will be 7 years of famine, because that is what the bull does. She replies that she has stored up grain and grass for 7 years, which she has, and that she will otherwise smash the gates of the underworld and let the dead out to eat the living, which is not a bluff anybody wants to test. He gives her the bull. The bull of heaven comes down to Uruk, and with its first snort, a pit opens in the earth, and 100 men fall in. With its second, 200 more. With its third, Enkidu falls in up to his waist, and climbs out, and grabs it by the horns. The two friends kill it together, Enkidu holding the tail, Gilgamesh driving a blade into the neck. And then Enkidu, who has now had enough of divine interference, tears off one of the bull's haunches and throws it at Ishtar, and shouts that he would do the same to her if he could catch her. The city celebrates. Gilgamesh asks who is the most glorious of men and answers his own question. There is a feast, and then everyone goes to sleep. And in that sleep, Enkidu has a dream. And the dream is the turning point of the poem and of everything that follows. He dreams that the great gods are sitting in council and that they are arguing. Two mortals have killed Humbaba, the guardian appointed by Enlil, and they have killed the bull of heaven. Something must be paid for this. One of them must die. The sun god argues on their behalf. Enlil overrules him, and the one who is chosen is not the king. It is Enkidu. He wakes and tells Gilgamesh, and then he does what a person does when they are told they are going to die for reasons that are not their fault. He rages. He curses the door he made from the cedar he crossed a continent to cut. He curses the trapper who found him. He curses Shamhat, who took him out of the wilderness, and he curses her with real cruelty, wishing her homeless and abused and old before her time. And then the sun god speaks to him and reminds him what Shamhat actually gave him: bread fit for a god, beer fit for a king, fine clothes, a friend, a beloved friend, a king who will lay him down on a great bed and set him on a seat of ease and have the people of Uruk weep for him. And Enkidu, hearing this, takes the curse back. He turns it around and blesses her instead. It is a small moment inside a long poem, and it is one of the reasons this text has survived being 4,000 years old, because the emotional logic of it, rage at the nearest available target, followed by shame, followed by an attempt to repair, is not ancient at all. Then he lies down, and he does not get up. He is ill for 12 days. He tells Gilgamesh about another dream, in which a creature with the face of a lion and the talons of a bird seized him and led him down to the house of dust, the Mesopotamian underworld, where the dead sit in darkness with feathers for clothing and eat clay, and where kings and priests and everyone else sit together with no rank at all. It is not a place of punishment. It is simply where everyone goes, and it is gray, and it lasts. This is worth pausing on, because it explains the desperation of everything that follows. The people who wrote this poem did not believe in a reward. There was no paradise in Mesopotamian religion, no weighing of the heart, no bright field where the good went and the wicked did not. There was a house below the earth, entered through 7 gates, ruled by a queen named Ereshkigal, where the dead sat in darkness with dust on the door and dust on the bolt, wearing feathers like birds, eating clay and drinking muddy water. Kings were there. Priests were there. So was everyone who had ever swept a floor. Rank did not survive the journey. The one thing that improved the condition of the dead was the attention of the living. Families poured out water and left food at small household shrines, and the dead depended on it. And a person with no descendants to make offerings was in real trouble down there, thirsty forever. That was the whole of the arrangement. Be remembered, be fed, or be a thirsty shadow. And a man who has just been told he is dying of an illness in a bed, with no children, is being told he is going to a dark room to eat dirt, and he knows it, and his friend knows it too. He grows weaker. On the last day, he says that he is dying, not in battle, not gloriously, but in a bed, and that a man who falls in battle at least dies well, and he does not. And then he dies, and Gilgamesh, who has never lost anything, sits with the body. The grief that follows is the longest and most detailed sequence of mourning in ancient literature, and it is what turns this poem from a good adventure into something else entirely. He calls on the roads to weep, and the forest, and the bear, and the hyena, and the panther, and the deer, and the elders of Uruk, and the farmers, and the mountains, He covers his friend's face like a bride's. He circles the body like a lioness whose cubs have been taken. He tears his hair and rips off his fine clothes. He commissions a statue of Enkidu with a body of gold and lapis. He orders a funeral of extraordinary richness. And then he sits there for 6 days and 7 nights, the same 6 days and 7 nights that Shamhat spent bringing Enkidu into the world of the living. And he will not allow the body to be buried. He waits. The text says that he did not give him up for burial until a maggot fell out of his nose. That is the line? There is no version of this poem, no translation, no retelling, in which that line is not the hinge. Everything before it is a king who talks about death and does not believe in it. Everything after it is a man who has seen what happens to a body and cannot unsee it. And what he says next is the honest thing, and it is not noble at all. He says, I am afraid of death. I shall die and be like Enkidu. And so he leaves the city in skins, unwashed, and goes out to find the one man who did not die. That man is called Utnapishtim, and he lives at the edge of the world, and he was given eternal life by the gods after a flood. Gilgamesh has heard of him the way one hears of a rumor, and he sets out with nothing resembling a plan, which is what people do. He wanders the wilderness. He kills lions and wears their skins. He does not wash. His hair grows matted, his face burns and cracks in the sun, and he sleeps where he falls. The king of the greatest city on earth becomes indistinguishable from the wild man he once wrestled in a doorway, which is not an accident of the plot. He has gone backwards through every stage of Enkidu's transformation, one at a time. He has given up the clean clothes, the oil, the bread, the bed, the roof, and the company of other people. He is walking his friend's life in reverse, and there is no one left to tell him to stop. He is unrecognizable, and he comes at last to a mountain called Mashu, where the sun rises and sets, and the gate through the mountain is guarded by scorpion people. Half human and half scorpion, whose gaze is death. They look at him and see that 2/3 of him is divine, and they let him speak. He tells them where he is going. They tell him it cannot be done. No one has ever crossed the mountain, they say. The passage is 12 leagues of total darkness, and there is no light in it at all. He asks anyway, and something in the asking persuades them, and they open the gate. The description of the passage is one of the finest pieces of writing in the poem, and it works by repetition. He travels 1 league, and the darkness is dense, and there is no light. He travels 2 leagues, and the darkness is dense, and there is no light. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At 9 leagues, he feels the north wind on his face. At 10, the light begins. At 11, dawn is breaking. At 12, he comes out into daylight, and he is standing in a garden where the trees bear fruit made of carnelian and lapis lazuli, and the thorns are rubies, and the whole thing is beautiful and hard and inedible. Beyond the garden is the sea, and by the sea is a tavern, kept by a woman named Siduri, who sees a filthy man in animal skins coming toward her, and does the sensible thing, which is to bolt the door and climb up on the roof. He threatens to break the door down. She asks him who he is, and he tells her, and she asks why, if he is a king, he looks like this, and he tells her about his friend, and Siduri gives him advice. In one older Babylonian version of the poem, her advice is the most famous passage in Mesopotamian literature. She tells him that the life he is looking for, he will never find, because when the gods made humanity, they kept eternal life for themselves and gave death to us. So, she says, fill your belly, be happy day and night, dance and play, wear clean clothes, wash your head and bathe. Look at the child who holds your hand, and let your wife delight in you. That, she says, is the work of humanity. He does not listen. It is the correct advice, and it is offered kindly, and it is exactly what he will come to at the end of the story by a much longer route, and he cannot hear it yet, because people who have just lost someone cannot hear it yet. Instead, he asks for directions, and she directs him to a ferryman named Urshanabi, who has the means of crossing the waters of death, water that cannot be touched by human skin. Gilgamesh, who solves most problems by attacking them, promptly smashes the stone objects that Urshanabi uses to make the crossing, which makes the trip considerably harder and is entirely his own fault. The ferryman sighs and sets him to cutting 300 punting poles so that the boat can be pushed across, using each pole once and throwing it away before the water touches his hand. And in this way, laboriously, one pole at a time, the king crosses the sea. On the far shore is an old man who watches him come. Utnapishtim listens to the whole story, and his first response is not sympathy. It is a lecture on the subject of impermanence delivered with the mild exasperation of someone who has heard this before. Nothing lasts, he says. Does a house stand forever? Does a contract hold forever? Does the river always rise? The dragonfly, he says, drifts on the river, and its face looks at the sun, and then suddenly there is nothing. The sleeping and the dead are alike. Then Gilgamesh asks the obvious question, which is how, in that case, this particular old man came to be standing here alive after all this time. And Utnapishtim tells him the secret, which is the flood. He says that long ago the gods, wearied by the noise of humanity, resolved to destroy it. The god Ea, who could not break his oath of silence directly, went and spoke to a reed wall, knowing that a man sleeping on the other side would overhear. He told the wall to tear down the house and build a boat, to abandon possessions and save life, to take aboard the seed of all living things. And Utnapishtim, listening, asked what he should tell the city, and Ea supplied him with a beautifully dishonest answer to give them about going away and rain falling and abundance arriving. He built the boat with the help of the whole town in 7 days, and he sealed it with pitch, and he slaughtered oxen and sheep, and gave the workmen wine to drink like river water, and they held a festival, and then he loaded his family and his craftsmen and the animals, and shut the door. The storm came at dawn. It was so violent that the gods themselves were frightened by it, and fled up to the highest heaven, and crouched there like dogs. Ishtar cried out that she wished she had never allowed it. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind and the flood flattened the land. On the 7th day, it stopped, and Utnapishtim opened a hatch, and light fell on his face, and he looked out, and all of humanity had turned to clay, and the surface of the sea was flat as a roof. He sat down and wept. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and he waited 7 days, and then he released a dove, which found nowhere to settle, and came back. Then a swallow, which came back. Then a raven, which found the waters receding, and ate, and circled, and did not come back. So he let everyone out, and made an offering, and the gods, who had not eaten in a while, gathered around it like flies. Enlil, who had ordered the destruction, was furious that anyone had survived. Ea argued with him and pointed out that punishing everyone for the sins of some was unjust, and that a lion or a famine would have been more proportionate. And Enlil, persuaded, went aboard the boat, took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, made them kneel, touched their foreheads, and granted them eternal life, and set them to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. This was the passage that George Smith found in 1872, and it is not difficult to see why it caused an uproar. A man warned by a god, a boat sealed with pitch, built to measurements, loaded with animals, a flood that covers the world, a mountain birds released one after another to test for dry land, an offering made on the mountaintop, and a god who smells it and is moved by it, and a promise that it will not happen again. Anyone in Victorian London who had ever sat through a sermon recognized it immediately, and the version on the tablet was older. What scholars have understood since is that neither account is copying the other in any simple way. The flood story existed in Mesopotamia in several forms before it ever appeared in this poem. There is an older Babylonian epic called Atrahasis, in which the gods send the flood because humanity has become too numerous and too loud for them to sleep, which is a wonderfully petty motive for the destruction of the world, and there is an older Sumerian version still. The story seems to have been in the air of that river valley for a very long time, in a place where the rivers genuinely did rise without warning and take everything, and where the difference between a good year and a drowned one was a matter of weeks. It traveled, and it was retold, and it turned up in the scriptures of a people who had themselves spent a generation living beside the canals of Babylon. Then Utnapishtim turns to Gilgamesh and asks the question that ends the search. Who, he asks, will call the gods to assembly for your sake, so that you can find the life you are looking for? It was a unique event. It happened once. It is not a door that is open. But he offers a test. If Gilgamesh wants to defeat death, he should start with death's little brother and stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh sits down to do it and falls asleep almost immediately. Utnapishtim's wife, who is the only person in the entire poem with a purely practical mind, tells her husband to wake him and send him home. Utnapishtim says no. He tells her to bake a loaf of bread each day and set it beside him so that he cannot deny it afterward. And so she does. And when Gilgamesh finally wakes and insists he has only just closed his eyes, there are 7 loaves in a row beside his head, one of them fresh, one still soft, one dried out, one gray with mold, one hard as stone. He can count. He has slept a week trying to prove he can stay awake, and there is no argument left to make. He is washed and given clean clothes that will not age until he reaches his city and put in the boat. And then, as the boat is pushing off, Utnapishtim's wife asks her husband whether he is really going to send the man away with nothing, and the old man relents and tells Gilgamesh a secret. There is a plant at the bottom of the sea, thorny like a rose, that restores a man to youth. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, sinks, finds it, cuts the stones loose, and rises with the plant in his hand. And here he does something that shows how much has changed in him. He does not eat it. He says he will carry it back to Uruk and give it to the old men there and try it on them and take it himself when he is old. The man who once wanted his name shouted has decided to bring something home for other people. On the way back, hot and tired, he stops at a pool of cool water and goes in to bathe. He puts the plant down on the bank. A snake, drawn by the scent, comes out of the water, takes the plant, and goes back into its hole, shedding its skin as it goes. That is how it ends. Not with a battle lost, not with a god's judgment, but with a man leaving something valuable on the ground for 10 minutes. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. He has crossed the mountain of the sun, and the waters of death, and the whole world, and he is going home with nothing. And now even the ferryman has been exiled and has to come with him. And then the poem takes them up to the walls of Uruk, and Gilgamesh, who at the beginning of the story was described in terms of those walls, turns to Urshanambi and says the same words that the poem opened with. Go up on the wall, walk along it, examine the foundations, inspect the brickwork, see whether it is not baked brick of the finest quality. One part of the city is buildings, one part is orchard, one part is clay pit, and the whole of it is Uruk. That is the answer. It is not a satisfying one, and it is not meant to be. He does not get eternal life. He gets a wall and a city, and the knowledge that what a person makes and leaves for others is the only part of them that stays. Siduri had told him this at a tavern by the sea in about 4 sentences, and it took him the rest of the poem to arrive at it. That, too, is not an ancient thing. There is one more question worth asking before we leave him, and it is the one everybody asks eventually, which is whether there was ever a real Gilgamesh. The answer is a careful maybe, and the evidence is more interesting than a straight yes would be. There exists a document called the Sumerian King List, a compilation that records the kings of the various cities of Mesopotamia in sequence, along with the lengths of their reigns. The early portion of it is plainly not history. It gives reigns of tens of thousands of years to kings who ruled before a great flood, which is the sort of thing that makes a historian close the tablet. But as it moves forward in time, the numbers shrink towards something plausible, and the names begin to match rulers who are independently attested. And in the section covering the first dynasty of Uruk, between a father described as a priest and a son who is otherwise unremarkable, sits Gilgamesh, credited with a reign of 126 years, which is too long, but not absurdly so, by the standards of the document. Other kings named in that same stretch turn up in real inscriptions. A ruler of Kish, named En-Mebarajesi, listed as a contemporary and a rival, was long assumed to be legendary until 2 fragments of a stone vessel were found bearing his name, which promoted him abruptly from myth to fact. If his rivals were real, the argument runs, he may well have been too. There is also a much later inscription concerning building work at a temple in Nippur that credits Gilgamesh of Uruk with construction there, and there is the wall itself. Archaeology at Uruk has found a massive circuit wall of the right general period, and the poem insists, twice, at the beginning and at the end, that this specific king built it. The most likely reading is that somewhere in the first half of the 3rd millennium, there was a king of Uruk of that name who did something memorable involving a wall and about whom stories began to be told. Those stories were still circulating centuries later in Sumerian, and we have several of them, and they are quite unlike the epic. They are shorter, looser, and much more like folk tales. In one, he and Enkidu go to a cedar mountain and deal with a guardian. In another, they kill the bull of heaven. In another, he loses 2 objects down a hole into the underworld and sends Enkidu to fetch them, with instructions on how to behave down there, and Enkidu ignores every single instruction and is trapped, and comes back only as a spirit to describe what the dead endure, ranked by how many sons they left behind. That last poem is the reason the standard epic has an odd 12th tablet stuck on the end, which contradicts the rest of the story entirely, since Enkidu is alive again in it with no explanation. It is a translated Sumerian poem appended to the main text by later scribes, apparently because it was thematically related, and they did not want to lose it. Most modern translations either omit it or print it separately with an apology. It is a useful reminder that the neat literary object we admire was assembled by people with their own priorities who were perfectly capable of stapling an incompatible ending onto the best poem in their language because it seemed a shame to leave it out. So, there was probably a man. What survives of him is not a single fact about anything he did. It is a poem about the day he understood he was going to die. There is one more thing worth saying about the century and a half since it came back. When the epic was first published, the interest was almost entirely in the flood, because that was the part that touched on something people already argued about. It took several more decades before anyone read it primarily as a poem. The 20th century did that, and once it started, it did not stop. It has been translated into dozens of languages, set as an opera, adapted for the stage, taught in schools, and rewritten as novels. Poets who could not read a word of Akkadian have produced versions from other people's versions. There is now more writing about Gilgamesh in circulation than there ever was in Akkadian. A poem that was lost for 2,000 years is currently being read by more people than read it in the whole of antiquity, which is a peculiar sort of victory for a man who wanted very badly not to be forgotten, and who was told, quite plainly, by an old man at the edge of the world that he could not have what he was asking for. The epic did not vanish because it was rejected. It vanished because the script it was written in died. As Aramaic and then Greek and then Arabic spread across Mesopotamia, cuneiform narrowed to a handful of priestly astronomers and then stopped sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era, and everything written in it went silent at once. The gods of Uruk were forgotten. The mounds grew over. For nearly 2,000 years, the oldest story in the world was a hill. And then a printer's apprentice with good eyes read a tablet about a flood, and it came back. It is still coming back. Fragments identified in the 21st century have added lines that no one had read since Assyria fell, including a passage describing the noise of the cedar forest, full of monkeys and birds, which was not part of the poem anyone knew a generation ago. The text you can read tonight is not the text scholars could read in 1900, and it will not be the text your grandchildren read, which is a strange kind of afterlife for a poem about a man who wanted to be remembered. He did not want a story. He wanted his body to keep going. What he got instead was 12 broken tablets in a burned library, and the patience of strangers 4,000 years later fitting the pieces back together by hand. That is the story of Gilgamesh, from a burned library in Nineveh to a king weeping on a riverbank with an empty hand, and the walls he built that outlasted every word he ever said about himself. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting on the screen whenever you feel ready. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments. But there is no rush now. Set it all aside. Let your shoulders drop, let the day go, and let yourself settle. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.